stove was cold, and that was the first thing Wardlow noticed, because a logging camp in December is never cold. You could be a mile off through the timber and still know a camp by the smell of it. Wood smoke, coal oil, wet wool drying, and there was none of that. He came up the last of the grade with the mule blowing steam and the runners of the sledge squealing on the ice, and the camp sat there in front of him exactly the way a camp is supposed to sit. Bunkhouses square to the clearing, cook shack with its pipe going up straight into the gray, tools on their hooks under the eave, hung the way a careful crew hangs them. Everything where it belonged, and no smoke, no sound, and no men. He called out once, and the mountain took the sound and gave nothing back. On the table in the cook shack there were tin plates set out, and in one of them the food had frozen where it sat. Beside two of the bunks, boots, just standing there on the boards, side by side, the way a man leaves them when he means to be back in a moment. 40 men worked that camp. 40 men were on the payroll the week before, and Wardlow walked every building of it twice and did not find one. My name is Ryan. Before I get into it, tell me where you're listening from tonight. Leave it down in the comments. I go through them, and I like knowing what part of the country this is reaching, what kind of dark it is out your window while you've got this on. And if you find you can't stop once these get their hooks in you, I put together a longer thing for exactly that. It's called What the Mountain Keeps. 10 of these. 10 Appalachian cases the law closed with the wrong word. Across 5 states and 62 years. 8 hours of it, start to finish. The link's in the description and pinned to the top of the comments. That's where you'll find it. The description and the pinned comment. Go on and grab it before we start, and then let me tell you about the camp on Shaver's Fork. I want to be careful about how I say this, because I've told it wrong before. Told it in a way that made it sound like a ghost story, and it isn't a ghost story. Everything in it is a thing you could put your hand on. A ledger, a wall, a path worn in the ground. That's what got to me about it in the end. There's nothing in the whole account you couldn't touch. It just doesn't add up to anything a sane man would do, and 40 of them did it together and did it neat. So let me tell it the way I got it, which is the long way from the paper up. The company was the Corliss Lumber Company out of Elkins. If you know that part of the state, you know Elkins, Randolph County, up in the Alleghenies, the town that timber and the railroad built practically overnight in the 1890s. In 1911, it was a boom place. Saw whine you could hear from the edge of town. Log trains coming down off Cheat Mountain stacked so high they looked like they'd tip on the curves. Corliss was a middling outfit, not one of the big names. They held a cutting lease on a tract up on the east side, back of Cheat Bridge, in the country that drops toward Shaver's Fork before it climbs again toward Bald Knob. High, cold, steep ground, red spruce and hemlock so thick the light came down green. The kind of place that, even now, with a good road most of the way in, feels like it doesn't especially want you there. Corliss set a camp up in there in the spring of 1911. I've seen the survey and the timber crews, and I've seen the first months of reports, and there's nothing in any of it but ordinary work. A camp of that size, 40 men, is a small, moving town. You've got your fallers and your buckers, the men who limbed and the men who set the chokers, teamsters for the horses, a blacksmith, a cook and a cookie, a clerk, and over all of it, a woods foreman. Theirs was a man named Emmett Cade. Cade's the one who mailed the reports. That's the thing I want you to hold on to, because it's the spine of the whole business. Every week, Cade wrote the company a report and sent it down with the log train or with whoever was going to town. Board foot count for the week, head count. What they'd felled, what they'd skidded to the landing, what they'd loaded. Any man hurt, any horse lame, any tool they needed sent up. Dull as a stone, most of them. I went through 40-some of those reports over 2 days in an archive room in Elkins with cotton gloves on, and for the better part of a year, they are the most boring thing you ever saw. 9,000 board feet, 11,000. A man cut his hand on the crosscut, laid up 2 days. Send more coal oil, send a barrel of lard. That's the whole music of it. And it wasn't just the reports. That's the thing about looking into something from the paper up. You find out how much paper a small operation throws off and how much of it survives when nobody's meaning it to. There was a payroll ledger, or part of one, water-stained down one edge, and I sat with it and a magnifying glass and worked out the names. 40 men, near enough, though the book runs a little loose at the edges the way those books do. A man hired on Tuesday and gone Thursday, a name entered and scratched, wages figured in a hand that isn't always Cade's. There was the cutting lease itself, the tract described in the old survey language, so many acres of merchantable spruce, penalties if the count fell short of the season. There was a timber cruise, a cruiser's tally of what stood on that ground before they touched it. And I'll tell you, reading a cruise for a stand of timber that's been gone 100 years is its own small sadness. All those trees counted and named and priced that nobody alive ever saw. There were requisitions. There were freight receipts for the log train. There was, buried in a folder in the Historical Society, a photograph. One photograph of the crew, lined up stiff outside a bunkhouse the way they did it then, a dozen or so of them squinting into a summer sun that would have been months from the winter that took them. And I looked at that photograph a long time, and I couldn't tell you which of them was Cade, and I couldn't tell you which two were Rawl and Whitaker, and I put it down because it isn't good to look too long at a thing like that. I chased every one of those threads down, and I'll save you the trouble. They all die. The lease is just a lease. The cruise is just a cruise. The county files have the tract changing hands the way tracts did, timber company to the state in the end, and not one line in any of it about 40 men. That's the part people don't understand about looking into an old thing. Most of what you find isn't a clue. Most of what you find is just the ordinary paper of an ordinary operation. And the horror of it, if there is one, is exactly that. That it's all so ordinary, all so much like the paper of 100 camps that ended the way camps are supposed to end, cut out and moved on and forgotten. The Corliss camp threw off the same ordinary paper as any of them, right up until the paper stopped meaning what it's supposed to mean. And then, along about the middle of October, and I'll be honest, the date's soft because one page is dated and the next three aren't, and the count on them doesn't line up clean with the pages that are. Along about the middle of October, the music changes. It doesn't change all at once. That's what I've never been able to get across to people. When you hear a story like this, you want it to turn on a dime. One night everything's fine, and the next it's all wrong. It wasn't like that. It came on the way. Weather comes on in those mountains, where you look up from your work and the ridge, you could see an hour ago is gone in the cloud, and you didn't notice it going. The first odd note is small. In a report I'd put around the third week of October, Cade writes his count as usual, and then at the bottom, almost like he's using up the paper, he adds a line. He says a couple of the men have complained they can't sleep, that there's a noise on the slope at night, and he's told them it's a bear working the slash pile and to leave it be. That's it. He's not worried. If anything, he sounds a little put out, the way a foreman would be, men bringing him fool complaints, a noise on the slope. Leave it be. Now, I've stood on that slope. I want to tell you about the slope, because you have to understand the geography, or none of the rest of it will land. The camp sat in a clearing they'd cut, low in a saddle between two shoulders of the ridge. The timber they were working, the good spruce, the whole reason they were up there, was downhill and to the north, toward the fork, and the landing where they loaded the logs was that way too, downhill, following the water, the way logging always follows the water. Everything that made sense to do in that camp pulled a man downhill and north. That was work. That was the whole map of the place. The slope, Cade means, the one with the noise on it, runs the other way. Up, south and up, away from the timber, away from the landing, up into a bench of ground where there wasn't a stick worth cutting, rock and laurel and old growth too gnarled to bother with. No reason on earth for a logging crew to go up there. Nothing up there to go to. Except there was one thing up there, and Cade wouldn't have known it when he set the camp, and I don't think the company knew it either, because it's not on their survey. Up on that bench, grown over in rhododendrons so thick you'd walk within 10 feet and never see it, there was an old mine. Not a coal mine like the ones that made the south of the state. A little thing. An old drift. A coal bank. The old people called them. Where somebody, decades before Corliss, before Elkins was even Elkins, had followed a seam into the hillside hoping it would pay, and it hadn't, and they'd walked off and left it. The mountains up there are full of them. Little failed diggings, a black mouth in the rock, a heap of spoil going to moss. Most of them you'd never find. Most of them nobody's thought about in 100 years. The men found this one. I'm sure of that now, though it took me a long time and a lot of walking to be sure. Somewhere in that October, the crew found the old mine on the bench above the camp, and the noise Cade wrote off as a bear was coming from up that way, and the couple of men who couldn't sleep were the two whose bunks sat nearest the slope. The next report I can date with any confidence is a week on, and the count's down. Not a lot, but a camp of 40 men that's been laying 11,000 board feet a week doesn't just drop to 7 for no reason, and Cade doesn't say why. He doesn't mention the noise again. What he mentions instead, and this is the first thing in all that paper that made the hair stand up on me, sitting in that quiet archive room in the middle of the afternoon. What he mentions is that 2 of his men have gone off. He says it flat. He says 2 men, and he names them, Amos Rawl and a younger fellow named Del Whitaker, have left the camp, and he doesn't know when, and he doesn't know how, because nobody saw them go and they didn't draw their pay. Their kit was still in the bunkhouse, Rawl's coat was on the peg, and Cade, you can feel him trying to keep it a foreman's problem, an accounting problem. Cade writes that he expects they've quit and gone down the mountain, and he'll dock them and hire on 2 more when he can get them. But a man doesn't quit in December in that country without his coat, and a man doesn't quit without his pay. Everybody up there was working for the pay. There was no other reason to be on that mountain in the cold. And Cade knew that, whatever he wrote. Because there's a report, it comes just after, where you can see him not believing his own explanation. He says he sent men out to look. He organized it the way a foreman would, split the crew and worked the ground down toward the fork and along the skid roads and out to the county road, the ways a man would go if he were walking off the mountain. And they found nothing. No track, and this is December, there's snow. A man walking out leaves a track, and they found none. And Cade writes that too, plain, that there was no trail. And then he goes back to calling it a quitting, as if the two things could both be true. 2 men gone off down the mountain, and no track of them going down the mountain. He couldn't hold both of those, and he held both of those, and you can feel it in the writing. A man setting down facts that won't sit together and refusing, yet to look at what they make. I've done that myself. Everybody has. You get a thing in front of you that your mind won't take, and you write down the pieces, and you keep the lid on the box they'd make if you let them fit. Cade kept the lid on as long as he could. You can watch him keep it on, week by week, in his own hand. Now here's where I have to tell you something about how you make sense of a thing like this, because I don't want you to think I'm reaching. When you spend your life in the woods, you learn to make out what men leave behind. It's most of the job, some seasons. Somebody doesn't come back to a trailhead, and you go up and you take the measure of it, and you learn that a camp, or a car, or a coat on a peg will tell you the truth if you'll shut up and let it. People lie. Ledgers don't. And the ledger of that camp, the coats, the boots, the frozen plates, the count going down, the ledger was saying one thing plainer and plainer, and the thing it was saying was, nobody's leaving. Whatever's happening, nobody's going down the mountain to get away from it. 2 men gone then, 38 left. And here's what the reports do after that, and it's the strangest turn in the whole account. Stranger than the mine, stranger even than what they found in it, to me anyway. The reports don't stop. Cade keeps writing. Week after week he keeps mailing the company his report. But they stop being about logs. The board foot count just falls away. 1 week, it's a scratch of a number and an apology. The ground's froze. The horses can't get purchase on the skid roads. They're doing what they can. The next week, there's no count at all, and in the place where the count had been, Cade starts writing about the men. He writes that the men won't sleep. Not can't. Won't. He writes that they've taken to being up on the slope at night and that he's ordered them down and they don't stay down. He writes, and I'm giving you the sense of it because I only got to look at those pages the once and I gave them back. He writes that the men have got it into their heads that there's work up there that has to be done and that it isn't logging, and that he can't make them see that it isn't the company's work and won't be paid. And then this line, which I've carried around for years now, he writes that he went up on the slope himself at night to fetch them down, and that he understood, once he was up there, why they wouldn't come. And he doesn't say what he understood. That's the whole sentence. He went up and he understood, and he came back and wrote it down and mailed it to the company in Elkins, and the company filed it, and there it sat for the better part of a century until a man with cotton gloves went through it in the afternoon. The company, for their part, and I want to be fair to them, because it would be easy to make them the villains and they aren't, or if they are, it's a small, dull villainy, not the interesting kind. The company did about what any company would, which is not much and slowly. A foreman writing peculiar letters and a board foot count going to nothing is, to an office in town, a labor problem. Maybe the man's drinking. Maybe he's lost his crew to a better wage down the line, which happened all the time in those years, men walking off one outfit for another that paid a nickel more. They wrote Cade back once, and I've seen that letter too, and it's the coldest thing in the file precisely because it's so ordinary. They tell him to get his count back up, or they'll send a man to see about it. They tell him the season's short and the work won't wait. Not one word about the men who wouldn't sleep. You get the feeling nobody in that office saw the letters as anything but a foreman falling down on the job. And Cade's last report, the last thing in his hand in the whole file, is short. It's got no count. It's got no request for lard or coal oil. It's a few lines, and the writing's gone bad, gone slantwise and pressed hard into the paper the way a man writes when his hands are cold or he's writing fast. He says the men are almost done. He says he stopped trying to bring them down because there's no sense in it, and because, this is the part I said I wouldn't explain and I won't, because I can't. He writes, the men say they need to finish closing it before it goes dark for good. That's the last of Cade. The next thing in the file isn't in Cade's hand, it's the company man, Wardlow. They sent him up when the reports quit coming altogether, when a week went by and then another, and there was nothing, no report, no count, no crew coming down for supplies, nothing. He went up the way I told you at the start, and he found the camp the way I told you. Cold stove, frozen plates, boots by the bunks, tools on their hooks, 40 men on the last payroll, and not a living one of them anywhere, and no sign, Wardlow wrote, of any struggle. No blood, no broken thing, no fire, nothing knocked over. He said it was like the camp had been set down whole and the men lifted out of it. Wardlow's report is the one the company acted on because Wardlow was one of theirs, and Cade, by then, they'd half decided was a crank. Wardlow searched the camp and searched the timber below it and found the men gone and wrote it up plain. And there's more in his report than the empty camp, and it's the part that ought to have set somebody's teeth on edge and didn't, and it comes down to what he found at the landing. The landing's where a camp stacks its cut logs to be loaded. And Wardlow found the landing stacked. Logs cut and skidded down and decked up ready, a good many of them, more than a week's worth, and never loaded, never hauled. The log train had quit coming up empty and going down empty because there was nobody to load it, and the wood just sat there at the landing, seasoning in the snow. Weeks of the crew's labor stacked and waiting on men who never came back to send it down the mountain. Now that tells you something exact, and I could make it out the way I would if I found it today. Men who mean to leave a camp finish out. They load what's cut, because that's the pay. That's money on the ground. No crew walks off from decked logs. Men who quit at the end of a cycle leave a clean landing. A landing stacked and abandoned means the work stopped in the middle. Not at a Saturday, not at the end of a season. In the middle of an ordinary week, with money lying on the ground, the men set the work down and did not pick it back up. That's not quitting. Nobody quits and leaves the pay decked at the landing. Wardlow didn't take it that way because Wardlow wasn't looking for that. Wardlow was looking for 40 men and counting empty bunks. But it's in his report, the stacked landing, and it sat in the file for 100 years waiting for somebody to do the arithmetic on it. There was a small stir. A sheriff came up from the county, spent a day or two, wrote his own short account that mostly agreed with Wardlow, and added a line about the two who'd gone earlier and left no track. And then the snow came on hard and closed the whole east side of that mountain. And there was nothing more anybody could do until spring. And by spring it was old news. A notice ran in a paper down in the valley, 3 or 4 lines. 40 men gone from a lumber camp, feared lost in the early snow. And that's the size of it. 40 men, and it made 3 lines. Because it was 1911, and it was the back of Cheat Mountain, and men were lost to those mountains every winter in 1s and 2s, froze or fell or drowned in the fork, and 40 at once was only a bigger number of the same ordinary tragedy, and the ground was already deep in snow, and you couldn't have searched it if you'd sent an army. So they wrote it down, and they let the operation go, and the war came a few years on and took everybody's attention, and the mountain kept it. For a long time, decades, that's where the account ended. A camp emptied out, men presumed lost, a cold case with no bodies, which isn't even really a case, it's just a sadness the files forgot about. And it would have stayed that, except for the path. Here's how I come into it, and I'll try to be quick about the part that's mine, because the part that's mine is the least interesting part until the very end. I work that country. The whole east side of it, back of Cheat Bridge, up toward Bald Knob and over toward the Fork. That's ground I walked for a lot of years in the green uniform, and you get to where you know it the way you know a face. And there's a thing that happens when you know ground that well. You start to notice the places where the ground doesn't match itself, where there's a straight line in a forest that has no business having a straight line, where the trees are one age on this side and another age on that, and you know something happened there that reset the clock. A fire, a slide, a clearing somebody cut and let grow back. I found the old camp clearing years before I ever knew what it was. It's mostly grown in now, but a camp leaves a bruise on the ground that takes a century to heal. The flat pads where the building sat, a few sills gone to punk, a scatter of square nails and stove parts, and the neck of a bottle. I knew it for an old logging camp the first time I stepped into it, the way you'd know it from the shape. I found myself reading it, without meaning to, the way you can't help reading ground, you know. The pads told me the size of it. You can pace off where a bunkhouse sat by the line of the rotted sill and the run of the flat, and the pads there said 2 long bunkhouses, which is a camp of some size, 30 or 40 men, not a little 6-man show. There was the low mound and the scatter of fire brick and cast iron where the cook shack stove had been, and a length of stovepipe gone to lace with rust, and the flat-lipped edge of ground where they'd have had the horses. All of it right. All of it where a logging camp puts things. There was even, and this is the kind of small true thing that stays with you, a boot sole. Just the sole, the leather long gone, the nailed-on sole of a work boot lying in the duff by one of the pads, and I picked it up and turned it over and set it back down because you leave things where they lie. And I didn't think a thing of it then. I thought about it later. I've thought about the boots a good deal. So I took it for a camp, an ordinary dead camp, and I'd have left it at that. One more ghost camp in a country full of them, and gone on down to the Fork. Except for the path. There was a path going up out of that clearing, south and up, and it was wrong. You've got to understand what 100 years will do to a path. Nothing. 100 years erases a path. A trail that hard people walked every day for a season. Once they stop, the woods take it back inside of a decade. Laurel and briar and duff, and in a century you'd never find it. But this one you could still see. Not walk, see. A trough, a swale in the ground where the earth had been worn down below the roots, and the roots had grown around the low place and held it so that 100 years on there was still a groove going up that slope, filled with moss now, but there, plain as a scar. And I stood at the bottom of it, and I did the arithmetic the way you learned to do it, and the arithmetic scared me before I knew a single thing about the camp. Because a path worn that deep isn't made by a few men going up a few times. A path worn that deep, worn below the roots, worn so it outlasts a century, that's a lot of feet going up and coming down over and over, packing the ground. And it was going the wrong way. It went up, away from where the timber was, away from where the work was, away from the water and the landing, and every reason a logging camp exists. It went up to a place where there was nothing to do. Or nothing to do that had to do with logs. I walked it. Of course I walked it. It's a couple 100 yards, steep, and it dead ends on that bench I told you about in the rhododendron. And if I hadn't been following the groove, I'd have walked right past what it ended at, because the mountain had done its work and closed the eye of it over with green. But the path took me to it, and I got down and pushed the laurel aside, and there was the mine. And it was sealed. Now, I'd seen sealed mines. It's a common thing. A mine gets abandoned, or a mine gets dangerous, and somebody closes the mouth so a fool or a cow doesn't wander in and get killed. Usually it's a cave-in, natural or set, the roof brought down to plug the hole. Sometimes, in later years, a poured concrete cap or a steel grate. What you almost never see, what I'd never seen before that day and haven't seen since, is a mine mouth, walled, bricked, closed by hand, stone laid up on stone, chinked and fitted, with timber set across and stone stacked against the timbers, the whole mouth of the drift filled in solid like the wall of a spring house. Somebody hadn't caved that mine. Somebody had built a wall in it. Careful, level, took time, took hands, took knowing how. And I want to be exact here, because this is the detail that the whole thing turns on. And I've thought about it more than I've thought about almost anything in my life. The wall was built from both sides. I could see it. When you lay a dry stone wall, you can tell which face was worked from where. The way the stones are fitted and the way the fill is packed behind them. And that wall had a worked face on the outside, laid up neat by somebody standing where I was standing, in the daylight, out on the bench. And behind it, packed against it, fitted to it, was stone laid up from the inside, from within the mine, worked by hands in the dark on the other side, closing themselves in as the outside closed them out. The two met in the middle. The wall was raised from both directions at once, by people on both sides of it, working toward each other until there was no gap left to work through. I stood there a long time. I don't mind telling you it's one of the few times in all my years in the woods I felt like I ought not be where I was. And there was one more thing. And this is the thing that made me start pulling on it instead of just walking away and letting the mountain keep its wall. The marks in the stone. When you split and set stone with old tools, the tools sign the work. A wedge leaves a track, an axe pole leaves a bruise, and if you know tools, you can near enough tell the tool. And the marks in that wall, the wedge tracks and the axe bruises, were logging tools, felling axes, splitting wedges, the tools of a timber crew, not a mason and not a miner. The wall over that mine had been raised with the tools that hang in a logging camp. That's when I went to Elkins and found the file. It took some doing. An old company's files get scattered, sold, boxed up in a historical society, half of them lost. But I found Cade's reports, and I went through them the way I told you. And I sat there in the afternoon with the count going down and the men who wouldn't sleep, and the two who went off without their coats and finished closing it before it goes dark for good. And I understood that the wall on the bench and the camp in the clearing were the same story. The 40 men of the Corliss camp in the winter of 1911 had left off cutting timber, worn a path up a slope to an old failed coal bank, and walled the mouth of it, with their own tools from both sides. And then they were gone, and the camp sat there full of their boots and their supper, and Wardlow came up and found the ledger of an empty place. You already know what was behind the wall. You knew before I said it, but I have to tell it, because there's a difference between knowing a thing and seeing it, and I saw it. It took me the better part of 2 years to get that mine opened, and I'm glad now that it took that long, because the slowness of it was the only decent thing about it. You can't just open a mine. It's on the books as a hazard once you report it. There's the question of whose ground it is, and it was public ground by then, which meant it was a matter for the office, and the office moved the way an office moves. There were papers to file. There was a mine safety man who had to certify the air before anybody went in, because old workings hold bad gas, and a sealed one especially. There was an archaeologist, once it got clear how old the wall was, and a decision that came down from somewhere above me. I never did learn exactly where, and I looked, that whatever was in there was to be treated as a grave until proven otherwise, and handled accordingly, with the care you'd give a grave, so it wasn't a crew of us with picks knocking a hole in a wall. It was slow, and it was documented, and it was quiet. And the day we finally took the wall down, we did it stone by stone, numbering them, the way you'd take apart something you meant to be able to put back. The mine safety man went first, before any of the rest of us, because an old sealed working is about the most dangerous hole there is. The air goes bad in them. It fills with the gases a mountain gives off, and the oxygen goes out of it. And men have died 3 steps inside an old mine, dropped like the string was cut from nothing you can see or smell. So he had his instruments, and he opened a small breach at the top of the wall first and put a tube through and took a reading of the air before anybody so much as leaned in. And I remember standing on that bench in the cold, watching him work his gauges, and I remember him going quiet. And I asked him what it showed, and he said the air behind the wall was old, but it wasn't as bad as it should be. That there was more moving air in there than a sealed drift ought to have. And he said one more thing, flat, not looking up from his gauge. Whatever took these men, it wasn't the air. A working that breathes like this one doesn't poison a man, and it doesn't turn his mind. Men cut coal in worse than that all their working days and walked home to supper. Bad air kills you where you drop, he said, and that was the end of what he'd say about it. But I did the rest of that sum myself, standing there. Bad air doesn't march 40 men up a hill and set them laying stone in courses. Whatever was wrong up there, it wasn't in the air. And the one plain, rational door I'd been holding open in the back of my mind for 2 years quietly shut. The moving air meant something else, too. It meant the mountain had a back way into it somewhere, a crack, a second opening we never did find. And it meant the wall on the bench was never the only way in or out. The men could have gone up the slope and into that mine and out again by some other seam, and back it down, over and over, wearing that path. It meant the wall wasn't a trap. Nobody was closing off the only door. They were closing off this door, on purpose, this particular mouth, and leaving the mountain its own hidden ways, which is a stranger thing than a trap when you sit with it. Then the archaeologist, because by then the age of the wall had been dated near enough that this was a 100-year matter and had to be handled like one. Every stone photographed in place before it came down, the fill sifted, the tool marks cast. And then, only then, the wall coming down course by numbered course, and the dark behind it that had been kept dark for 100 years, opening up a hand's width at a time to the daylight. And behind the wall we found the 40, all of them. That's the thing I can give you that the camp couldn't give Wardlow. An end to the arithmetic. 40 men left off the last payroll. 2, Rawl and Whitaker, gone earlier, and we found them too, so the 2 are part of the 40, not extra to it. Every man of that camp was in the mine. Behind the wall, their own tools had raised, and they weren't at the wall. Men sealed in against their will, die at the wall, clawing at the last barrier where the air and the light were. These men were set back from it, deeper in the drift, ranged along the 2 rock walls in some order, and turned inward toward the dark end of the working, their tools laid down beside them and not gripped in their hands. What 100 years will do to a man in a dry, sealed drift, I'll leave alone, out of respect, except to say there was enough left, with what we had to work from, to count them and in time to give most of them their names back. They were buried as people, in a churchyard down in the valley, 100 years late with a stone. That much got made right. But here's where the findings stopped answering anything and started asking. Because I'd gone into it, 2 years of paperwork and clearances and a mine safety man and an archaeologist, I'd gone into all of it thinking I was closing a case. 40 men lost in 1911, and I'd found where they went, and that's a closed case, that's a resolution. That's the kind of thing you retire on, the old mystery you finally put to bed. I put nothing to bed. I dug up a worse question than the one I started with, because look at what the scene says, and I mean really look at it. The way I taught you to make out the camp. When men are trapped, when they seal themselves in fleeing something, you can tell that. There's panic in it. There's a barricade thrown up, fast, ill-made, one-sided, stuff piled against a door from the inside, because whatever's on the other side is what you're afraid of. That's a thing I've seen, and it's plain to see. Fear and haste, and one side of a wall. This wasn't that. This wall was made from both sides, which means there were men on the outside, helping to wall it shut. Men who weren't trapped, who could have walked back down to the camp and the stove in their own boots, and who instead stayed on that bench in the cold and laid stone until they'd sealed their partners in, and then, near as I can tell, sealed themselves in behind. And it was made well. Level courses. Fitted stone. The care of men doing a job they meant to do right, not the desperation of men keeping a door shut. There was no barricade in it. There was craftsmanship in it. 40 men who put down the work they were paid to do and picked up a different work that nobody paid them for and nobody asked of them, and did it with everything they had, and did it together, and did it well. And the last thing any of them did on this earth was fill the last gap in a wall between themselves and the daylight. Against what? For what? I can tell you what the old people said, and I want to be careful how I hand it to you because it's not evidence. It's what folks say, and folks say a lot. But I went down into the hollows below that mountain after, and I sat on some porches, and I asked, and there were a couple of old men and one old woman who knew the mine, knew of it, and none of them wanted much to talk about it, and the way they didn't want to talk about it told me more than the talking did. The mine had a name, they said, from before the coal outfit ever came, from before the coal outfit that came before Corliss. An old name, a hollow name, and I got the shape of it, but I'll keep it to myself, because 2 of the 3 people who told it to me quiet, with a look toward the ridge, and asked me not to go saying it up there, and I've walked those woods enough to have some respect for that, even if I can't tell you it means anything. There had been a coal company in there once, they said, long before Corliss, that had gone in after that seam the way the drift showed somebody had, and they'd sealed it and pulled out. Not because it played out. That was the thing the old woman was sure of and said twice. Not because the coal ran out, because of something else that she wouldn't name and I think couldn't, and they closed the mouth and they left. And that was a generation or more before a timber outfit from Elkins came up the far side of that mountain without any idea what was on the bench and set a camp of 40 men in the saddle just below it. That's what I have. That's the whole of it. And you can see it never closes. It's the opposite of closing. Every hard fact in it, the ledger, the reports, the path, the wall from both sides, the tool marks, the 40 inside. Every fact, I can lay my hand on points at the same impossible middle, and none of them will say what's in it. 40 men. Sane men. Working men. Men with names and pay coming in coats on the pegs. In the space of about 2 months, in the winter of 1911, on the back of Cheat Mountain, they set down their work in the middle of an ordinary day. The logs were cut and stacked at the landing and never hauled. That's a fact, too. They stopped in the middle, not at the end. They wore a path up a slope to a place there was no reason to go, and they walled themselves into a mountain methodically from both sides with their own axes and wedges. And they did it, as near as anything can be told from what they left, calmly, as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world, as if it were the work that mattered, and the timber was the thing that didn't, as if they were closing something up, or being closed up, or both. And I can't tell you which, and I can't tell you what, and neither could the file, and neither could the old people, and neither, at the last, could Cade, who wrote before it goes dark for good and mailed it down the mountain and then went up the slope and helped lay the stone. I told you I'd gone in thinking I'd put a 100-year-old case to rest. What I did instead was open the one thing those men had gone to such trouble to shut, and I stood in the mouth of it with the wall down and the daylight running into a dark that had been kept from the light for a century. And I'll tell you what I've never put in a report. A man works a job like mine long enough, he stops reading ground with his head. It gets down into the body. You come up on a slope, and before you've thought a thing, your feet have decided it's going to slide. You step onto old snow, and you know it's rotten a half second before your eyes find the reason. It isn't knowing, it's recognizing. The way you recognize bad ice, you don't have to be told. And standing at that open mouth with the numbered stones of the wall stacked behind me, I recognized the place. Not what was wrong with it. I never got that, and I've made my peace with never getting it. But that it was wrong, that it was ground meant to stay shut, and that whoever sealed it before Corliss ever came had stood about where I was standing and taken the same reading off it. A reading plain enough to make a man leave good coal in a mountain and wall the mountain over and go and never write down why. I'd have called that superstition before. Standing there, I couldn't. We documented all of it. Photographs, measurements, the wall stone by numbered stone, the remains handled as a grave and given back their names and buried like Christians. We did the work right. And when the work was done, when there was nothing left to learn from it that the mountain was going to give up, there was a meeting about what to do with the mine mouth now that it stood open. And when it came around to a vote, and it wasn't really a vote, it was a formality, but it came around to each of us to say, I was the first one to say seal it back, wall it up. Not the way they'd done it, because we didn't have their reason, whatever it was, but shut it up. Put the stone back and the timber across and the fill behind it, and let the laurel take the mouth of it again and take the path off the maps and leave that bench to the mountain. They did. It's closed now. You couldn't find it. I made sure of that. Every so often somebody who's heard a piece of this asks me what I think was in there, what the men were closing in or closing out. And I tell them the truth, which is that I don't know, and that finding the bodies didn't tell me, and that I've made my peace with not knowing, mostly. But I'll say one thing I've never been able to shake. The wall was built from both sides. That's the fact I go back to. Men on the outside, who were free to leave, who stayed to help wall it shut, and then closed themselves in last. Whatever those men were doing up on that bench in the winter of 1911, not one of them, at the end, thought the safe side of that wall was the side with the daylight on it. That's where I leave it. If you want the other 10, the ones the law closed with the wrong word, the 5 states, 62 years, 8 hours of the kind of dark this one came out of. That's what the mountain keeps, and it's down in the description and pinned to the top of the comments. The description and the pinned comment. That's where the link is.